But we're amazed, I can't see you, but I can see you. Bunch of return people, thank you for coming again. Couple things before we get started is that we have actually 3 more presentations after Dr. Anfinson, who is our 4th for the year. Harold, you up and cruising? And they've all been well attended, and they've all been fabulous. We'll be putting them out on YouTube, links to our Facebook page very soon, thanks to the Prescott Cable Commission. And when you leave, if you don't have a schedule of the rest of our presentations, we have them. There was one change to the schedule. On Prescott Day Saturday, Captain Tom Struby is going to do a 1 o'clock show, and he's going to do a 3:30 show. Because Tom has filled the house every single time, and Prescott Days we think will be a big event. Couple things, as you know, we are self-funded. We get a little help from the city, a little help from the county, a little help from the Chamber of Commerce, a couple foundations, a couple families, the Rowan family and the Mercury family have been really significant contributors to us. If you notice our $27,000 paint job and new signs that were completed a couple months ago, we've really been trying. And we love to see you here because you're why we're doing this. Our job is to draw you to Prescott. You should come out of your houses, come for an hour. It's a wonderful thing to see you again. So I'm going to read through this so I shut up. We are a nonprofit depending upon donations, so if you can help us, please do. Our presentations are made possible by a partnership of the Prescott Chamber of Commerce, City of Prescott, Pierce County Tourism Committee, Prescott Foundation, and others. PHS has a solid core of members who make things happen. Mary Pat House, Errol Marilla, Elise Block, Chris Baltasek, Tom and Kathy Oz, Shar Molly, Susan Metcalf, Trish Foreman, Tanya Kipe, Mary Boland, Joe Globitz, Linda Bjorklund, Tom Blank, Tracy Franick, and me, Dallas Eggers. Also, we're always looking for new members. So if you have an interest in history or interest in Prescott history, come and talk to us. We have resources, we have things that we can't even put out, but maybe we can help you find lost relatives or lost information. I've been working on John here to find steamboat information. And so now, without further ado, I've introduce you to Dr. John Anfinson. I've been reading his stuff for a couple decades or more. Him and I get on the 5-minute phone call, and it's usually a half hour, 45 minutes. And I absolutely love it. And so now, Dr. John Anfinson. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John. So this is a presentation. This is different than a lot of this, the steamboat or the pilot boat stories you're here. This is going to be a very different presentation. I hope the images show up well on the TVs because it's really meant for big screen shows, but I'll try to explain it, and if you got a question, just let me know. So this presentation is about the greatest disaster in Minneapolis history. So some of you may be wondering, why am I giving a presentation of St. Anthony Falls in Prescott? And one of the reasons is that a catastrophic failure of St. Anthony Falls would impact Prescott and many other communities on the river, and I'll tell you why. Another reason is that St. Anthony Falls is the Mississippi River's only waterfall, and its stories are national stories. So this is one of the most renowned places on the whole Mississippi River. What I want you to take away is how close that St. Anthony Falls came to ending and how vulnerable it still might be to that fate. St. Anthony Falls lies one tick of the geologic clock from completing a 12,000-year journey. And holding back that clock is a dam or cutoff wall that few people know exists. It spans the Mississippi River from the east to the west banks. And on this slide, you can see that there's this image of a wall going across the river. So that's if the wall was on the surface. It's not on the surface. It's way under the surface. The 39-foot cutoff wall lies deep beneath the last of the limestone riverbed. For 150 years, that wall has withstood the relentless demands of nature to finish its task. If it or the geology around it failed and we couldn't get control, St. Anthony Falls would unravel again. The river would begin cutting down its bed to level up the nearly 50-foot difference from above the falls to below it. And everything resting on top of the limestone could collapse. As the water started eating away the sandstone that's under the limestone, and everything could collapse that's resting on that limestone, including this horseshoe dam above St. Anthony, or at St. Anthony Falls, and the 3rd Avenue Bridge. Minneapolis draws its water supply from that reservoir, so if the horseshoe dams, it fails, it creates that reservoir. Minneapolis only has a 3-day reserve of water, and it supplies all the water to all or part of 7 suburbs and to the international airport. 3 days, everybody who's relying on that water is out of water. As the river cut down its bed, it would create a rapids for miles upstream, threatening more infrastructure. In a 2021 report, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers stated, the 19th century architects of the falls recognized that the loss of the falls would be catastrophic, and added, the same conclusion applies today. Consequently, the Corps declared, it seems self-evident that the falls cannot be allowed to unravel. But who would stop it from unraveling? No one accepts ownership or responsibility for that cutoff wall. I don't know whether the cutoff wall will fail today, tomorrow, or in another 150 years. No one does. No one has inspected it or the geology surrounding it for the last 150 years, until when the Corps completed it in November 24th, 1876. Until now. In 2023, the Minnesota legislature provided the University of Minnesota's St. Anthony Falls Laboratory with $1 million to do the first study of the cutoff wall. The university submitted its summer report to the Minnesota legislature on July 1st, and they uploaded the full report just on July 20th. I was the lab's river historian for this study. So this is the geologically critical, significant area. There's this area about 1,200 feet from the spillway up to about Nicollet Island where the limestone cap rock ends, where St. Anthony Falls should have ended by now. And 3 layers comprise the geology. The first is Platteville limestone. In the river, the limestone tapers from about 12 feet thick at the downstream end to only 2.5 feet at the upstream end. The river has cut away the top 2 layers, the Magnolia and Hidden Falls members in the river, and only the Mifflin and Pecatonica remain. Under Hennepin Island, the limestone is still about 30 feet thick. The Mifflin layer is lined with fracture joints, as seen in this image from inside the horseshoe dam when they drained it. As a result, it breaks apart in large slabs, almost as if it was cut by a saw. The next layer is Glenwood shale. It's compacted silt, clay, and mud, and when exposed to air, it kind of crumbles apart. And below the shale lies a deep deposit of St. Peter sandstone. Some layers are nearly pure silica. You can carve your initials into it with your finger almost. It's so friable, they call it. And this is critical. Water flows through seams in horizontal and vertical layers in that sandstone. So due to this geology, St. Anthony Falls has retreated about 15 miles upriver over the past 12,000 years. At one time it lay down where downtown St. Paul is now, and then it was known as the River Warren Falls. After laboring against the limestone for thousands of years, nature had nearly ended the falls by 1848. By 1848, only 1,600 feet of the limestone remained. Those arrows on that map, think of that last arrowhead, that's it, that's what's left of all the limestone in St. Anthony. Until 1848, natural forces defined the fall's physical appearance, the sounds it made, and the rate and path of its retreat. But beginning in 1848, the sight and sounds of the natural falls began to disappear, and human actions defined its physical character and actually hastened its retreat. Franklin Steele completed the first dam at St. Anthony Falls. It came out from the east bank to about 20 feet above Hennepin Island and then went up to Nicollet Island. But from 1856 to 1857, I think the millers wanted to they knew the west side was going to open soon, and so they angled a new dam out into the west channel to capture more of that flow and direct it to their mills. Not until 1885 did the U.S. open the west side to settlement, and when it did, the Minneapolis Mill Company, representing the west side millers, began building a platform dam or platform for their sawmills, and then they angled a dam upriver to meet that from the east side. Finished in 1858, the combined dams formed a V that directed water to the mills on either side of the river. The Horseshoe Dam, however, accelerated the fall's retreat. While water could pour over it when high, As the river fell, it directed all the water to the mills on the east and west bank. And they left the area inside what we call the horseshoe, dry and exposed, and then subject to freezing and thawing, the limestone began cracking and spalling. So had the erosion, so the center of the falls, and then logs come over all these huge logs that they start coming over the falls and pound that leading edge, which also starts to accelerate it more. Look at how far St. Anthony Falls retreated in just a decade. Had the erosion continued at this pace, the falls would have disappeared in less than 40 years. And the rate would have increased as the downstream edge approached the upstream edge of the limestone, the rate would have increased. And this is something the millers are going to learn very soon. To prevent this future, the Minneapolis Mill Company started building a timber apron over the West Falls in 1866. And as the construction began, the St. Paul Daily Press called people to pay their last respects to St. Anthony Falls. For soon the paper lamented, the heavy plunge of the Amber Mississippi will be heard no more. To save the falls, the engineers will stifle the voice of nature with wooden aprons. The paper worried needlessly. An 1867 flood ripped apart the newly completed apron. In his January 9, 1869 report to Corps of Engineers headquarters, General G.K. Warren, the 1st St. Paul District Commander, described how the falls had been retreating for ages. And then he warned, there is but 1,100 feet of this rock left above the crest of the falls. When this shall have gone, but a few days or hours will be required to sweep away the soft material remaining and produce a long rapid extending far above, not merely destroying the water power, but a long reach of navigable river. One more flood, like that of 1867, he added, might complete the destruction. And he added, we see that there is cause for the most serious apprehension, and that the emergency is pressing. After 2 years of wrangling over who would construct the new apron, work began in July of 1869. This time the Minneapolis Tribune called readers to say farewell to the natural falls. The paper proclaimed, it is a stupendous work to accomplish, but engineering skill, are there any engineers in the room? Good. Just kidding. Yet engineering skill will overcome all obstacles, and so the muddy falls of St. Anthony have been made to succumb to man and are now subject to his will as a child. Never taunt nature.
No.
In September, the Mississippi River tore hundreds of logs loose from their booms and destroyed the apron. The failed efforts to build an apron barely slowed milling at the falls. By 1869, lumber milling was the #1 industry in Minneapolis, and flour milling was growing even faster. So, by the fall of 1869, Minneapolis was one of the nation's leading lumber-producing cities and on track to becoming the nation's leading flour milling city. The millers had funneled the river away from the center of the falls, accelerating its retreat. 2 efforts to build an apron had failed. General Warren believed St. Anthony Falls lay one major flood away from ending. Despite the warning signs, the millers believed their extraordinary progress could not be delayed or denied. Then came the Eastman Tunnel project. On September 2nd, 1868, workers began digging a 2,650-foot long tunnel through that soft sandstone, under the limestone, under Hennepin Island, under the river, and up to Nicollet Island. It was going to be a tail race for a magnet manufacturing center for mills on Nicollet Island that William Eastman and John Merriam were going to build. So by Saturday, October 2nd, the workers had reached the toe of Nicollet Island, and they went home for the weekend. They returned on Monday morning, October 4th, to find water rushing through the tunnel. And Morton Hinch was one of those workmen, and he published his account in the Minneapolis Star in 1924. Hinch remembered, I was working on the tunnel at the time the crash came. At first, the seepage began to increase, and then chunks of sandstone became loose from the walls and dropped into the tunnel. It was heraus, which is German for out, for the workmen. At the upper end, the rushing water expanded a 6-foot tunnel to a cavern 10 to 90 feet wide. And about nightfall, a 100-foot section of the tunnel, of limestone over the tunnel collapsed. So that's the area inside the circle with the black in it. The next morning, another 100-foot section at the end of Hennepin Island gave way, threatening Summit Mills and other buildings. And then at the upper end of the line, the riverbed collapsed into that cavern underneath, and a whirlpool formed off the southwest side of Nicollet Island. With a roar, Hinch reported, the logs dived to the bottom, and didn't come up until they had passed the falls. The whole river went dry as water rushed into the tunnel and belched out below Hennepin Island. At first, volunteers threw whatever they could into the whirlpool: brush, logs, dirt, whole trees, and loads of hay. But one account said the river swallowed them like eggshells, engulfed it as if it were so much snow. They hurriedly built a raft and floated it over the whirlpool, which sucked it to the river bed. They piled on dirt and rocks to hold it down. It looked, another account boasted, as though man's cunning had triumphed over the river. I think there's a deal with newspaper writers at this time where they're really talking about the control of nature, humans dominating nature. About noon, the account continued, the great raft went down in the center. It seemed that the river was about to take the lives of 100 for their attempt to curb its will. Through divine providence or nature's will, the raft heaved up, allowing everyone to scramble off before the river consumed it, and the break grew twice as big. A less sensationalist report said there were only about 25 people on the raft, and only one man went down with it, but they were able to pull him to shore. But they said about 25 people narrowly escaped drowning. So they built another raft, floated it out over the bigger whirlpool, which sucked it to the river bed. But the river took that raft down too. Then around 3 o'clock, the river destroyed the second raft, and the breach grew again. And then at 4:30, an even larger section collapsed. The power of falling water had turned against the millers. To gain control, the workers enclosed the area with cofferdams. Cofferdams are structures that can enclose a section of river so you can pump the water out and people can work inside of it. By October 19th, the cofferdams had reduced the flow enough for the millers to inspect the tunnel, and they found large cavities underneath the limestone between Nicollet and Hennepin Islands, and planned to begin repairs soon. But at 1 o'clock the next day, a whirlpool formed between Nicollet and Hennepin Islands. Focusing on the facts, the Minneapolis Tribune's local department reported, when the break occurred, the water rushed through the tunnel with such force that it was thrown out of a shaft at the head of Hennepin Island 30 to 40 feet into the air. Imagine a large geyser erupting from the head of Hennepin Island. Fearing detractors would cast doubt about the city's future, Minneapolis Tribune's front page story scoffed at them, saying, "It will be seen by reference to our local department that another crevasse has taken place on the other side of the river. And therefore, there is now therefore an excellent opportunity for those who scare easy to go into convulsions over an anticipated calamity, and the concoctors of sensation telegrams to ply their vocation." I think sensation telegrams must have been like the mid-19th century version of provocative tweets that were just said. To deal with the new break, workers enclosed the entire area between Nicollet and Hennepin Island with cofferdams. Despite the Tribune's dismissal, the October breaks were just the opening scenes of a calamity that threatened to destroy St. Anthony Falls. A key takeaway, or a key lesson from this, is that if a large enough cavity forms under the limestone, it will collapse. Consider this, until October 1869, erosion at the downstream end had been the greatest threat to St. Anthony Falls. Now the danger came from upstream too. Think of a short candle as now burning fiercely at both ends. Everyone knew what was at stake, and they realized that only the Corps of Engineers had the expertise and the access to the funding needed to save the falls. The Corps had opened its St. Paul District Office in 1866, placing it under General Warren. November 16th, Warren visited the falls, but he had no authority to fix what the millers had let loose. He could, however, conduct surveys, so he engaged Franklin Cook, a civil engineer, and the guy in charge of excavating the Eastman Tunnel, to study the situation. But the millers couldn't wait and began repairing the damage themselves. They still hoped that the federal government would step in. The Minnesota congressional delegation, the city, the governor had all tried to get the federal government to help, and it failed. U.S. representatives from other states objected. At one hearing, Representative James Mullins of Tennessee asked, who derives benefit from that water power? The government or the individuals? There had to be a federal purpose, a federal interest in saving the falls. It couldn't be just about the millers. General Warren supplied an argument. Since 1866, he had been promoting navigation above the falls. He even thought that they could connect Lake Superior with a canal to the upper Mississippi River. Warren rushed Cook's report to Lieutenant General Andrew Humphreys, the head of the Corps of Engineers. Stressing his concern, he wrote, there is great urgency for attention to this matter at once, if it is ever to be done. Adding to the urgency, in April 1870, flood destroyed the cofferdams, entered the tunnel, expanded the cavities underneath the limestone, and at the downstream end, another section of the tunnel collapsed, taking the Summit Mills and a warehouse with it. Building on Warren's arguments, proponents finally convinced Congress to help. On July 11, 1870, Congress appropriated $50,000 for the Corps to help save the falls. Over the next year, the Corps cleared out the debris and began filling all the cavities. But water kept leaking in to the tunnel. Then, on July 3rd, 1871, water found a way under the limestone in the east channel between Nicollet Island and the east shore. It then went over to the Eastman Tunnel, that water. And when I tell you about these tunnels, they're not little tunnels. They're 14 feet wide by 16 and a half feet deep in cases. So they're massive, massive tunnels. So the water carves this new path, this kind of magenta line, goes over the Eastman Tunnel, goes down the Eastman Tunnel, hits a plug of debris, and since it can no longer go that way, it carves a path out the west side of Hennepin Island, which the Corps of Engineers will label the West Branch after this time. So this event told the Corps that a scour event could begin anywhere along that upper edge of the limestone. So they conducted a survey of the limestone's upper end, and they found it filled with cavities. This is my rendering of what the idea is. There's a cavity at the upper end of the limestone, and there's seams in the limestone. And so they found that there was a seam about 14 feet down that connected to one of those cavities. And Cook believed that that seam had connected to the Eastman Tunnel once the Eastman Tunnel got close enough and then blew it out. He also thought it explained the ongoing leaks in the tunnel. So Cook proposed building a cutoff wall under the limestone the full width of the river. Without it, he emphasized, the destruction of the falls is certain. The new district commander, Colonel John McComb, agreed and called for a formal Board of Engineers review. On August 10, 1872, the board visited the site. That evening, they met with a large group from Minneapolis who offered their ideas for fixing the falls. 2 days later, the board presented their recommendations. They urged completing the timber apron, and they agreed that a cutoff wall was the best solution to saving St. Anthony Falls. But they added, this involves a cost far in excess of the funds now available. Since the Corps did not have the funding to build such a massive undertaking, they adopted the city's plan of just lining and plugging the tunnel. But these efforts ignored the persistent and ominous seepage under the limestone through the sandstone. Then, on April 15th, so these black lines are the cofferdams around the southern end of Nicollet Island. Then on April 15th, the Mississippi River ripped a 150-foot wide gap in the west side of the cofferdam, flooding the tunnel and drowning one man. The flood destroyed a masonry bulkhead that had been under construction during the winter and tore apart much of the tunnel lining. Once the water subsided, the Corps repaired the cofferdam and planned to begin their repairs soon. But water kept leaking through the sandstone off the west side of Nicollet Island. The Mississippi River was probing for weaknesses in the Corps' defensive works. On May 17th, it found one in the West Channel. Water scoured a new path under the limestone in the West Channel, went over to the Eastman Tunnel, went down the Eastman Tunnel, and then scoured out even more of the sandstone underneath the Eastman Tunnel. So that's the blue line now. So look at it, it's starting to become honeycombed. It's not just one tunnel under the falls. For over 4 years, the Corps faced one crisis after another, and now multiple tunnels ran under the limestone. Corps Captain William Benyard revealed how extensive the damage had become. In one area, the cavity was 100 feet wide by 90 feet long and in danger of collapsing. So, he explained, it became necessary to build walls and columns for the purpose of supporting the limestone. This image shows a timber and rock structure spanning one 90-foot wide section, a long section of the 100-foot wide cavern. The support wall was 16.5 feet high. I put a little guy kind of in the middle there who's about 6 feet tall just to give you the scale of that wall. Wherever a cavity exceeded 20 feet, they built these walls. During my work on the project, oops, that's the wall. Sorry, I should explain that. No wonder you fixed the little guy. So during my work on this project, I discovered this December 10th, 1873 map. It shows most of the structures holding up the riverbed between Nicollet and Hennepin Islands. The full length of the cavern between the two islands is 469 feet, and in places more than 120 feet wide. For context, here are those structures. Here's that map on the current landscape. The area has 3 massive bulkheads and over 22 support structures. Without the support structures, that entire riverbed between Nicollet and Hennepin Islands would likely just collapse. On November 29th, 1873, the Corps had plugged all the cavities under the limestone and had built a new bulkhead in the tunnel. To test their work, the blue indicates that them letting water flow in a coffer-dammed area. They wanted to test their work to see if everything was holding. Everything held, but just on the tunnel downstream of the bulkhead, a spring started coming up inside the tunnel, which meant it was bypassing all the work the Corps had done, despite all their efforts to stop it. Unless they address this, more scour events were likely. Oops, gotta go back one. So, Major Farquhar, the 3rd St. Paul District Commander, to work on the project, to him it meant that water was avoiding all the work they had done, and they're going to have to do something more serious, potentially like building a cutoff wall. So St. Anthony Falls had arrived at that moment you see in so many movies where the hero is trying to defuse a bomb as the last seconds count down. St. Anthony Falls' last seconds are literally counting down. Based on his observations, Farquhar concluded, I am more convinced that the proper place to build a watertight dam to cut off all the water flowing through the sand rock is as near the natural crest of the falls as possible. In response, on April 14th, the Corps convened another board of engineers. The board recommended completing the apron. Building 2 roll dams, they're called, inside the horseshoe dam, so that if water flowed into the horseshoe, there'd be little dams that held water at least 5 or 6 feet deep all the time inside the horseshoe. And like the 1872 board, they recommended a cutoff wall the full width of the river. This time, Congress agreed for the federal purpose of preserving navigation above the falls. So the Corps began work on the cutoff wall on July 9, 1874. The first thing they did was sink a shaft over the Eastman Tunnel on Hennepin Island and went right down to it. They found it had been eroded to a level of 25 feet and filled with quicksand. Then they started excavating cavities for the cutoff wall below the limestone, through the sandstone and shale to the east and west banks. They called each level a drift, a word I will use as well. Along the top level, they built a small rail car track, and they used this to haul out sandstone and shale and bring in cement and supplies. At 27 feet below the limestone, they widened the excavation from 4 feet to 6.5 feet to allow for a passageway in the bottom of the wall, but also has a wider base to the bottom of the wall. Then they built the wall up layer by layer. By October 1875, in early October 1875, a reporter and an engraver from the Minneapolis Tribune went and toured the cutoff wall. And here's how they described it. In descending from the top of the tunnel, the reporter wrote, we witnessed a weird picture. The excavation here is visible from top to bottom, none of the wall being in. Down a slanting railway track, we look into a pit where the workmen are swinging their picks and shovels and moving cars with a dim, dusky light to show that they are there. Assistant Engineer J.L. Gillespie, the on-site manager for the Corps, reported that the kerosene lanterns providing the dim, dusky light were 145 test degree lanterns. And he found it necessary to add, there were no explosions. Nature, however, hadn't given up. On April 9th, 1875, an ice jam broke above St. Anthony Falls and sent a 4-foot tsunami over Hennepin Island and down the shaft. Luckily, nobody was in it, but the flood weakened the east side cofferdam. 6 days later, a section of the dam gave way, and several days later, another section gave way, and the river scoured another new tunnel, the green line there, under the limestone and went over and connected further down into the Eastman Tunnel. Once the Corps restored the cofferdam, they found that again it had carved out such huge holes in the sandstone that they had to build more bracing structures on that part of the river. Then, on July 8, 1875, workers had a strong spring 370 feet west of the shaft. And within hours, the sand had filled portions of the lower drift. And this spring would cause problems throughout July and into August. And left alone, this would have caused another scar event. The dotted line, that's where that scar event was headed. Where the spring caused a sandstone to cave down, it created a cavity above the cutoff wall, 10 to 15 feet wide, that extended 100 feet above the wall. How would you like to have been one of the workers on this project? Kerosene lanterns, the walls collapsing and falling, water coming in. Nature was still seeking any path it could to end the falls, but nature is patient. By November 14th, 1876, the Corps reported that they had filled the old tunnel, its branches, and the breaches in the limestone with well-rammed gravel. Despite the dangers and the setbacks, the engineers placed the last load of cement in the cutoff wall on November 24th, 1876, 6 years after the first collapse. This is what the wall looks like under Hennepin Island and under the river. The water, limestone, and then the cutoff wall beneath it. 4 days before the Corps finished it, the Minneapolis Tribune proclaimed, "The final completion of the great sustaining wall removes the only obstacle that has ever seriously threatened the ongoing progress of Minneapolis. And if you accept the reporter's account, we have nothing to fear." Issuing the greatest taunt to nature yet, he said, "This artificial fortress is to stand guard for ages and defy floods. No power is to move it. It is more lasting than nature itself." But nature can work slowly and subtly. Multiple leaks within the first year after the wall's completion raised questions about this fortress. One emerged about 100 feet west of the west branch. This is number 1 on the map. To test the wall, there was a pipe through the cutoff wall in the west branch, and they closed with a valve. They closed the valve and let water rise on the upstream side of the wall. What happened was water went up through one of the fractures in the limestone, over the wall, and water came down to the back side of the wall, fast enough to scour a cavity and send water running to the west branch. So Major Farquhar had his men cut a new drift along the back side of the wall, find the leak, put it into a pipe, line the cavity with concrete, and fill it with gravel. This event suggests that where other joints, there's multiple joints that cross over the cutoff wall. That could happen if the water rises on the upstream side. Again, water could go over the wall and down. The other leaks were farther away. These are 2A and B on the map. Again, testing the wall, they closed that valve and let the water rise on the upstream side. They soon found a large stream of water coming into the west branch about 30 feet downstream of the wall. And so Major Farquhar again had his man started excavating a drift along the back side of the wall. And I found this map. The Corps of Engineers didn't know where this exploratory drift was. You can see the turquoise line there. That's the exploratory drift the Corps will excavate on the back side of the wall to find these leaks. But by July, they carried the exploratory drift 200 feet west of the west branch. And what they discovered was one of the layers of concrete had not bonded to the one below. Water was streaming through the wall. So I tried to create a rendering of this, like water streaming through the wall on the backside, creating a cavity again. So they lined this one again with cement, they filled it with gravel, but Farquhar dismissed the leak, saying it was easily closed. In his final account, From July 11, 1878, however, Farquhar informed Corps headquarters that he'd continue that exploratory drift to 470 feet out into the river, out under the Horseshoe Dam. In this account, they found multiple leaks coming through the wall. The upper layer where that tunnel had been had not bonded to the wall below it. So multiple leaks are coming through the wall itself. The engineers directed all the leakages of the wall into a drain pipe, lined the cavity with concrete, and backed out. Farquhar believed that the leaks were slowing and closed on their own over time. We don't know whether they did or did not. And we don't know if leaks have developed at other points or through other places in the wall. And I have to wonder, why didn't one layer bond to the other? I did find in the Corps records at the National Archives in Kansas City, they used 5 different kinds of cement, which I can tell you more about. So every color on this map represents a weakening of St. Anthony Falls, taking it ever closer to its end. So remember, the wall was just one component of the Corps project. They also had to finish the apron, and they had to build these 2 roll dams inside the Horseshoe Dam. They finished the 2 roll dams by January of 1877, again guaranteeing at least 5 to 6 feet of water inside the horseshoe at all times. The Corps completed the apron in 1876, but water rushing down the slope of that apron carved holes at the bottom of it 30 to 40 feet deep into the riverbed. So during the winter of 1877 to 78, the Corps put 128 cubic yards of granite boulders along the bottom of the wall, of the apron. But, of course, the water rushing down during floods removed all the boulders and just sent them downstream. The Corps would continue working on that apron up until 1885, when the Corps finally just quit funding, basically, the millers at the falls at this point. With the wall in place, Minneapolis rose to become the nation's leading flour milling center in 1880, a title it would hold for half a century. You could say the cutoff wall made Betty Crocker, Pillsbury and Gold Medal flour, and General Mills possible. The navigation General Warren imagined in the late 19th century didn't happen, but from 1963 to 2015, for 52 years, the cutoff wall made navigation above St. Anthony Falls possible. While navigation has ended, the cutoff wall still serves critical economic, infrastructure, and social needs. Too much now depends on preserving St. Anthony Falls to let it unravel again. Do you believe nature has stopped trying to end St. Anthony Falls, stopped probing for weaknesses it can exploit? In 1876, the Minneapolis Tribune reporter thought the wall would outlast nature itself. Revisiting the falls about 1880, General Warren said, "Only eternal vigilance will preserve the falls of St. Anthony." Until now, there has been almost no vigilance. Silently and invisibly, the cutoff wall has been saving St. Anthony Falls for on November 24th this year, 150 years. Nearly everyone had forgotten about it. But Corps plans to leave the locks and dams at St. Anthony Falls renewed interest in the wall and raised questions about its integrity. While not accepting ownership, and the Corps and the university made that clear in the legislation that by doing this study they didn't accept ownership, the state finally realized that a study was long overdue and funded it. I will tell you this, the laboratory found no evidence of an impending failure of the cutoff wall or the surrounding geology. They did identify some reasons for concern and made a number of recommendations for what should come next. The study had 4 primary elements. The first was a detailed history of the events that led to the collapse of St. Anthony Falls and the near destruction, how the Corps built the wall, and then what did we know about the cutoff wall from 1876 up to the present. That was my part of the project, and you just heard much of what I wrote about in the report. The second objective is to determine if there are any cavities in the sandstone. And that was a key piece of it, because as I said, cavities mean limestone falling. To answer this question, we turned to 3 geophysical methods in a company that really specialized in these methods. Think of these as an MRI or ultrasound for the geology at St. Anthony Falls. The first method was multi-channel analysis of surface waves. This is where you hit the ground really hard and it produces these P and S waves that are seismic waves like you'd get in an earthquake. And these waves move through different rock at different speeds, and if they hit a void, the void has become very clear when you do that testing. Ideally, these waves would distinguish between a hard rock and a void. The next method was electroresistivity tomography. And with this method, they put a bunch of electrodes in the ground in pairs, and then they run electrical currents into the ground. And again, rocks resist electricity at different rates, so you can measure how it's passing through the ground. Are there cavities or not? The last method was ground penetrating radar, and this uses radio waves at different frequencies, and they put these radio waves down into the ground. Again, what's the reflection like? What are you learning about the integrity of the ground underneath you? Again, these methods should have revealed whether there were voids in the sandstone or not. All three methods failed miserably. They couldn't even penetrate the limestone, much less get it past the shale or sandstone. Consequently, this is a big piece of the study, like half the funding. We had to figure out another way to evaluate the potential for a failure of the cutoff wall or the surrounding geology. So we employed a high-tech drone. This is a $100,000 drone to inspect the Eastman and West Branch tunnels. These are the only two pathways that you can go up to the wall and still see it. But the tunnels are so deteriorated and so dangerous that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission only requires Xcel Energy to go up into those tunnels every 10 years. If you wait 10 years, there could be a major issue happening inside one of those tunnels that you would never know about that would lead to a major failure at the falls. Using the drone, let us inspect the West Branch all the way at 200 feet up to the cutoff wall. And it let us explore about a quarter, a third of the Eastman Tunnel before there was water in there and the propeller just kicked up too much water and it had to back out. So this is what the drone looks like in the Eastman Tunnel. The previous photos and videos we had from other surveys of the tunnels were just terrible. You could hardly even see what you were looking at. But the drone images, both video and stills, are just crystal clear. And not only did we get great resolution of video, using laser technology, the drones gave us an exact rendering of the 360-degree landscape of what it's like inside these tunnels. And so we can take these drone images and compare them to two historic maps I had found in my research. This is a map of the Eastman Tunnel. The long red line is the Eastman Tunnel. The cutoff wall is at the upper end, and the Hennepin Island plant is at the other end. And also look at the bottom. There's sketches along the bottom. There's sketches at different points in the tunnel, and they show images of the sediment inside the tunnel and the water inside the tunnel. And then we had a 1936 map of the West Branch. Again, we could do the whole tunnel, but there were sketches of what it was like at different points inside the tunnel. So we could take the drone image and compare it to the historic sketch and see had there been a change in the amount of sediment or amount of water in the tunnel. And we'll be able to keep, with regular monitoring, we'll be able to keep doing this year after year to see if there's a change. This should tell us something's going on. Another key aspect, I guess you know what I'm doing here on time, another key aspect was the lab was to come up with potential failure modes and work with Hennepin County Emergency Management on a risk assessment of those failure modes. The risk assessment was to identify infrastructure, life safety, economic consequences of a failure. So as a natural feature, we could predict when St. Anthony Falls was going to end. That's a progression line. If it kept going at the same rate, we would know when it was going to end. But due to the cutoff wall, the falls are no longer a fully natural feature. We can no longer predict when it might end. And we can't talk about the probability of a failure. What we can talk about, we had long debates about this, as you can imagine. We can talk about the plausibility, not probability, the plausibility of a failure based on the history of what we know happened there and on the physical interventions that have been made over time. So St. Anthony Falls lab came up with 5 plausible scenarios. This box outlines the area of the Eastman Tunnel. If water got into the upper end of the Eastman Tunnel, it's got that big white tunnel. Huge openings, just water can, and massive volumes flow out. The blue lines in that image are tunnels from the Hennepin Island plant. So all these tunnels provide major access for flow routes if there's a failure upstream. The same thing is true of the West Branch. If water got into there's a failure at the upper end of the wall or in the limestone somewhere, and water got into the West Branch, it would just, again, like blow it out. It would just be massive amount, and you see a rapid deterioration of the falls. We also had to worry about the 3rd Avenue Bridge. The piers of the 3rd Avenue Bridge rest right on the limestone and put 6,600 pounds per square inch on the limestone. There was nothing on the limestone when it collapsed before. Imagine if there's a cavity under the pier. It'll punch right through that limestone. And then we also have to look at the horseshoe dam. If the collapse occurred within the horseshoe dam, you know, so all of a sudden there's a whirlpool inside the middle of the horseshoe dam, that could take out the dam, it could take out the 3rd Avenue Bridge, it could affect the cutoff wall, and it could cause more of the sandstone. Because once the opening's open, it's going to start, water's going to get under there and start just cutting away more and more sandstone. The other one was, the last plausible alternative was looking at right along the cutoff wall. If there's a failure on either side of the cutoff wall, what would that mean if the limestone collapsed? Major Allen, the 4th District Commander to work on it, he said that the cutoff wall was only a diaphragm, it was not a dam. It needed the sandstone behind it to hold it up. If there's a cavity on the backside, the wall can't support itself, and it could crack or start breaking over. So we had to look at what would the consequences be of cavities on the upper downstream side of the wall. We also looked at the west side of the cutoff wall, but the sandstone there is so hard that the core shortened the wall by 50 feet. Plus, the spillway now in the lock, their foundations go deeper than the cutoff wall. So there's really no chance of a failure on the west side. We also had to look at something called, put those both in context of 2 bigger scenarios. And the scenarios are, one is that it's a failure, like what happened in the 1860s and 70s. There's a part of the limestone collapses, and so it's probably hard to see, but there's a little hatched area, and there's a hole in it. So that's like a cavity we had in 1869, okay? So, but in this case, we're gonna get control of it. There might be some damage, things could happen, but we'll save the falls. Scenario 2 is the one we worry about most, because in scenario 2, all the limestone fails, and the river starts carving its way upstream to level up that nearly 50-foot difference. And what we came up with is the fact that within the first few hours a week, anything a mile upstream could fail and be impacted. Within a month, 2 miles upstream could be impacted. Within the first 6 months, up to 3 miles, and over a 2-year period maybe, up to 12 miles upstream. Bridges. And on those bridges, there's fiber optic. There's also electrical cables. All that stuff is at risk. There's even water mains that go under the riverbed. Again, that would be affected. And of course, the Minneapolis water supply is 4 miles upstream. Its intake would come out of the water. The erosion would rapidly slow over time, but it really depends on how much water is flowing in the river. So one reason that no one has studied this is that normally when you do a risk assessment, and the Corps has done this many times for St. Anthony Falls, as Excel has, is they look at the risks that are likely, and they say, well, here are the 10 most likely risks. A failure of the cutoff wall is number 15. We got stuff we can see, we got stuff we can measure, we got stuff we can repair. So they ignore number 15 because it's just, it doesn't seem like they have to look at it. From a standard risk assessment perspective, St. Anthony Falls was a black swan hazard. As defined by Nassim Taleb, these are hazards that are rare, unpredictable, unimagined, the risks that few people know about, they have a low probability but high impacts, and there are risks where someone says, why didn't you see that coming? Look at all the clues. You should have figured that out. That was coming. And then, of course, there's all kinds of lawsuits as a result. So, but due to the lab study and all that we found in our big, long report, it is no longer a black swan event. People know about it. You can prepare for it. There can be emergency response plans. So these are the basic recommendations. Determine who owns the cutoff wall. Regular monitoring of the tunnels. Regular monitoring of the 3rd Avenue bridge piers. Assessing the integrity of both tunnels. Developing an emergency response plan. Evaluating the impacts of a horseshoe dam failure on the Minneapolis water supply. Again, it's not just Minneapolis, it's those 7 suburbs and the international airport. And monitor the groundwater level above the cutoff wall. So those are the recommendations. Again, the laboratory, Singapore laboratory study has eliminated the black swan event. There's no excuse for not knowing about it now. So I'm going to end there and take any questions you might have. There's a lot of serious engineering, science, geology, and I'm a historian, so I had to learn a lot for this project. I got to tell you, I lost an argument with the geologists and the engineers. They thought my writing was too much humanities style writing, and they wanted to be more scientific. So. Any questions about this? Yeah.
John, you mentioned General Warren. How long was he in charge of this district? I see his name mentioned many times.
1866 to 1869.
Okay.
The Corps of Engineers usually changes engineers about every 3 years.
Okay. Then when you look at the logging industry on the Mississippi River, did they curtail logging activities during this or not?
The Corps of Engineers had to get multiple injunctions against the lumber companies.
Mm-hmm.
They kept running logs over the apron and destroying the apron. And there was one angle on the apron, they called it at this time, it wrapped around Hampton Island. And the water was scouring like holes 30 feet deep, 40 feet deep at that angle. But the millers would they would direct the logs almost right at that angle. And then Joe Bassett, one of the millers, he starts excavating a foundation for a new mill on the west side, and he dumps all his debris in the horseshoe dam, on the west side, which forces all the water over to the angle in the apron. And so they had to get an injunction against Joe Bassett. And that's one of the reasons that the Corps finally left, was that from 1876 on to 1885, everything they tried to do, the millers just ignored. They just kept destroying the apron. And so the Congress finally said, it's yours, Minneapolis. So no, the lumber companies were not good.
That's where you used to
Well, there were a few billion board feet of log that came over that falls.
They actually built a sluiceway for the lumber so that it wouldn't hurt the falls. And the millers didn't use the sluiceway most of the time.
Because as the lumber petered out on the St. Croix, the mill right over here, and half a mile away from us, bought the logs coming over St. Anthony Falls, towed them here and sawed them here.
Yeah, I mean, the lumber companies are saying, hey, this is our navigation. This is our commerce. We're sending our commerce down the river. We have a right to go over the falls, which is why the Corps built the sluiceway so they could do it without damaging the falls. But again, the Corps finally just left in 1886, and they would not come back until the Upper Harbor project, where they're going to build the upper and lower locks and dams.
There's a couple river pilots in here, and I bet this is kind of interesting to them, because both of them have been up there a number of times, didn't even know I was unaware of what was underneath the water.
I lived on Nicollet Island for 15 years, so I knew a lot about things.
They did good. Yeah.
What was the purpose of the Eastman Tunnel?
So it was a tail race. So when you build a mill, you have the head race where the water comes in, it goes through your turbines, and it goes down out the tail race. So it's the exit tunnel, okay?
Okay.
So Eastman and Merriam bought Nicollet Island, and they're going to build a big manufacturing center on the island, powered by the water there. But the water was already dammed. The river was already dammed. So they sued the Minneapolis Mill Company downstream, saying, under Eastern water law, we're above you and we have priority right to the water. So rather than get into a big, long court case, they said, we'll compromise. You can dig a long tail race underneath the island and build your mills. And then what people can't figure out is, why would you excavate that tunnel all the way up and not line it as you went? Which they didn't do. But they didn't know. I mean, that was a black swan event, because they had no clue that where the limestone ended had seams in the sandstone, that once that tunnel got near it, that sandstone just connected to that tunnel. So it was its own black swan event. I can't believe you guys are here on a Friday night for this. God, you're doing some magic. Yeah.
Why didn't they use that sluiceway that the Corps built for the logs?
I think they just, good question. I think they just didn't want to mess with it, because it wasn't very wide, and they had to kind of guide every single log into the sluiceway, where they could just let flow over the falls and go float its way downriver instead of like over the falls. It was funny, there's some great quotes about it. The millers, or the lumber millers, claimed that, well, the log, there's a flood, or the boom just gave away because of high water. And Major Allen writes that he kind of noticed that there was a connection between the time they needed the logs and when the booms broke. So, yeah.
I got a question for you. I thought they wanted to take Upper Lock out. That mean they had no water.
So there's a chance to take out, so in 2014 Act, Congress permanently closed the Upper Lock to navigation. That closed the next 2 locks and dams downstream in effect. Because any towboat and barges that went through Lock and Dam 1 to the Ford Dam had to go through Lower St. Anthony and then Upper to get to a barge terminal. Since they can no longer do that, the Corps wants to leave all 3 sites. Lower St. Anthony Fall Lock and Dam and Lock and Dam 1. Now, there's a real opportunity to remove those 2 locks and dams, adapt or reuse them in some new way. We're trying to figure that. That's probably the talk I'm giving the most. It is the talk I'm giving the most right now, is the future of those 2 locks and dams. The Upper Lock has been taken over by an organization called Oamni Amni Okadeape, a Dakota Indian-led organization. And they are repurposing the lock. They're trying to make a more natural area out of it. The dam, as I say in my talk on the future of the river in the Twin Cities, you can't take the dam on. It'll destroy St. Anthony Falls, take out Minneapolis' water supply. At some point, their vision is to remove the lock itself, but they'd have to build a dam at the upper end. Otherwise, you'd lose St. Anthony Falls.
Do they realize how much it'll cost to take all that out?
I think they're thinking about it. So one of the things I have in my backpack is the National Parks Conservation Association just completed a recreation economic study of dam removal in the gorge of the lower end one, and so they looked at 4 cities around the country, actually more than 4 cities, but and they hired a recreation economist to do this study and say, we know there's going to be a lot of cost, but what would the benefits be? And so the benefits on this study showed in the communities where they've revitalized their rivers, not necessarily dam removal, but revitalized the rivers, provided better access, there's a 13 million to 33 million annual return on the investment. There's an increase of 300,000 to 1.3 million users in those areas. So in the what we call the gorge from St. Anthony to the Minnesota confluence, given the size of our metro area, we could see 500,000 people on that river. I've been on rivers out west where they put, Boise, Idaho puts 100,000 people through downtown Boise, through Parkland, through the center of the city every year. They're only a population of 765,000, we're 3.5 million in the Twin Cities. So, but Friends of the Mississippi River just got $923,000 to conduct a dam removal feasibility study, and they're going to look at all the questions. Every time someone says, well, what about this, what about that? My answer is, we got to study it. Because what I want is at the end of that process, is that we as a society of the 21st century make the best decision. If the best decision is keep them, let's keep them. If the best decision is remove them, let's remove them. Or something in between. So I should also mention that the St. Anthony Fall Lab received $427,000 this last year. They're going to build a model, a 90-foot long model in the lab at St. Anthony Falls of what the river would look like above Lock and Dam 1 if you removed the dam. Well, there's over 5 million cubic yards of sediment, shall we say, above that dam. Where it's going to go and what is in it. So that model should be completed by end of September.
Is it going to be open to the public?
You know, they give all kinds of tours of the lab, and the public comes in there a lot. I am also on that study team with the University of Minnesota Laboratory. So I can come and give a talk on that in the future.
Any other questions for John? Go ahead, Tim.
What is the fall from, it's 50 feet on St. Anthony Falls, but from St. Anthony Falls to the Minnesota River, that's called the gorge?
Yeah.
How big?
I found an 1887 map by Major Charles Allen. I'll say this really quickly. I've been looking for them. I got them from the Cartographic Division of the National Archives in Washington. There are 3 sheets, St. Paul for Snelling, the Marshall Lake Bridge halfway up, Lake Marshall to St. Anthony. Each map is 9 feet long. On that map, Major Allen gives the slope of the river's surface to the hundredth, to the thousandths of a foot. Okay, there's my bell. He's got, it's like a school bell, you're all gonna get up and run on it. He measured the velocity in the upper part of the gorge at 9 locations to the hundredth of a foot per second. The upper gorge from the toe of St. Anthony Falls to the Marshall Avenue Bridge falls 36 feet. From Marshall Avenue Bridge to the confluence, 14 feet. The total drop is, by his numbers, of 50.5 feet over that 8.5 miles. So, and then the lower gorge, the map has got over a dozen big islands in the lower gorge. The upper gorge, at one point, he numbers the boulders. And this is the steep part where the rapids is. He numbers the boulders 6 to 90. So we're really getting a good physical sense of what the river would be like without locks and dams. And the lab is going to build its model largely based on these maps.
Wow.
Cool. These are always fun, folks.
Yes.
Any further questions for John?
I'm going to say afterwards, so if you have a
All right,
question
John's
after, I have a couple things.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Did it make sense? I mean, I give that talk. I talked to someone on the Stone Arch Bridge, a photographer for the Tribune, and he said, well, can a diver go down and look at it? I'm like, they got to swim through limestone to get to it.